And so with that first false start, here we go, Gregory. Thank you very much.
Cool. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thanks, Lori, for inviting me to do this. And really, like, kudos to the whole PPAC team for organizing these talks. I think it's just a really great way to keep us all connected and help to keep us sane in these times. Yeah, I'll jump right into it. So I have a slideshow that I'll take you guys through. Lori, could you enable my screen sharing?
All done.
Cool. And it's great to see so many familiar faces as well. Hello, everybody. Here we go. So let me minimize that, get that out of the way. So I'm going to talk about a project I made a few years ago. It's called Flowers for Donald. And I wanted to take you guys through some of the influences and ideas that kind of really helped shape the work into what it's become now. And this is the first picture of the series that I made, and it was made just 3 days after the election. Basically, like, my wife and I had just moved to Philadelphia in October of 2016 after finishing grad school in Rochester, New York. So we were new here, like, we were ready to start a new life, and I was kind of wondering what kind of work I would be making next. I didn't have anything in mind, and then this election happened, and I'm sure, you know, all of you kind of feel the same way about it as I do, and maybe you all felt the same kind of paralysis, really, and just the shock that I felt after, like, the morning after the election. It was a few days afterwards that we decided to go to the Philly Museum of Art just to, like, look at some art and try to clear our minds and try to find, you know, some kind of breath of fresh air. And I ended up coming across this Van Gogh painting, one of his sunflower paintings, in the rotunda on the second floor. And I was just really, like, hypnotized by it, and I'm still not sure why, but I ended up spending maybe 3 or 5 minutes just, like, really close to it, like maybe closer than I should have been standing to it, like really digging into, like, the brush strokes and the texture and just admiring, like, just how beautiful it was. And so when I came back home, I decided to do a little reading about those sunflower paintings that he made, and I came across this quote, which was found in one of the letters that he wrote to his brother Theo in 1888. So he wrote, "Besides, you know that Gauguin likes them extraordinarily," talking about the sunflower paintings. He said to me about them, among other things, that's the flower. You know that Jeannin has the peony, Quo has the hollyhock, but I have the sunflower in a way. And I just really fell in love with that idea that an artist can kind of claim a flower for themselves, because flowers are such a common motif within the history of art. You know, you'd be hard pressed to find any artist who hasn't dealt with flowers in one way or another at some point in their career. And I really love that idea of kind of using flowers and participating in kind of this grand conversation that so many other artists have participated in, which is basically, like, I kind of imagine, you know, every artist who ever lived standing in one big room, and all of them are broken off into circles talking about different things. And, like, I imagine a big circle of artists just talking about flowers and how each one kind of looks at what they represent and what they could be. So after that, I made this picture. I don't really fully understand still, like, where it came from. But what I did was I went to Google and I just Googled the word flowers. I picked an image out of that search and I brought it into Photoshop and I made this picture. And I think one of the things that hit me most after the election wasn't just that this dude got elected, but just looking at the numbers of how many people had voted for him and just how many people in our country thought that this was going to be a good idea. And so maybe in some ways this picture is kind of made out of, you know, just to channel that frustration and anger at, you know, so many people who voted for this guy and brought him into power. I'm sure all of you, like me, come across pictures like this on a regular basis on Facebook and on Instagram and on Twitter. You know, I feel like there's a form of political discourse now that uses kind of these rudimentary collage techniques as a way to kind of convey political rhetoric and as a really kind of crude way to envision new political realities. It's almost kind of like a visual wish list in a way where, you know, the author will kind of envision what political outcome they hope will happen and make a picture that can kind of realize that in visual form. And you know, I think there's a point where like words can become inadequate and the power of an image can really it assert itself in a way that kind of delivers a political idea or a political message. And you know, for me, it's a really kind of persuasive form of communication. It's really effective because you can push back against spoken or written words very easily if you're debating someone in person or if you're having a debate online. But in order to kind of adequately respond to a picture like this, you know, it almost takes a new picture in return, where you kind of have to push against that visual rhetoric in its native form. And we see like mass media outlets also kind of adopting collage strategies to bring these ideas to life. And this was, of course, a very recent, it's not particularly collage, but I feel like it's close enough. You know, for me, it makes just a really powerful political statement and just a really simple visual idea. So before I go to that one, so it kind of feels like, you know, with all of this political kind of messaging that we witness on the internet, it feels like we're kind of in the midst of like a meme war where political ideas are exchanged via visual metaphor. And you know, a lot of people using collage techniques and appropriating existing images kind of as a vessel for that. I was also really inspired by a lot of the satire that occurred during the 2016 campaign, particularly how it felt like a lot of political satire just seemed to fall flat in the face of what this guy represented. Like it felt like he presents such a spectacle and there's such a circus that's surrounding him at all times that any criticism, you know, delivered in the form of humor, like it always kind of felt inadequate. And so a lot of what I'm doing in this work is just kind of questioning that role of satire and just what good it can do against the real and really kind of dangerous political realities, you know, that we're living through. So I'm going to show you a few of the early pictures where I showed you that first one, and then I kind of moved on to try to make some more kind of visually ambitious images that are a little more involved. And you know, most of my visual material came from web searches, a lot of screen grabs. I used a lot of kind of visual signatures from like social media, like these emoji icons come from the live Facebook videos. and using kind of this motif of like the iPhone camera roll to kind of reference the way, that technology is really mediating our experience with politics. Some of these early pictures are pretty rough looking. And I think really they represent kind of my learning how to make the kind of picture that I wanted to. And I treated a lot of these as, I wanted to make a kind of picture that felt almost interactive, like maybe it's kind of like a touch screen that's just loaded with like different information, kind of mirroring the experience of looking at news online with like all this text and all these links and all these pictures that you can click on and bring you into someplace else. And really trying to kind of match that feeling of like information overload that comes with our kind of just our contemporary world of media. So, going back to like the, the kind of really crude, common forms of like political collage and memes, I feel like the work I was doing, it was just really kind of a more advanced version of that, maybe, where, I kind of set the bar higher in terms of the labor that someone would have to go through in order to kind of properly rebut or kind of criticize the ideas in my pictures. And as I was making these and as I was developing the work, I was looking, I was doing a lot of looking back at the history of collage and the kind of legacy of collage that developed over the 20th century. This is a picture by Hannah Hock, who was a German artist who participated in the Dada artist movement. And if you don't know Dada, it was basically an art movement in Europe that rose pretty much from the ashes of World War I. And essentially it was a collection of artists in Berlin, in Zurich, in Paris, who were trying to like reflect on the new reality that followed the war and the devastation that it caused through Europe. And they really sought to reject the kinds of artistic movements and values that came before them, kind of in terms of thinking that the past modes of expression were inadequate in their ability to speak to this new reality that they were living in post-war Europe. So artists like Hannah Hock here and others like Raoul Hausmann, Kurt Schwitters were some other artists in the Dada movement who are making collage, largely drawing material from newspapers and magazines, almost as a way to kind of use that source to critique itself in how media represented politics in the world, during that time. This is John Hartfield. He was another German artist. John Hartfield was a designer and an artist. He did a lot of covers for books and magazines, and his work was very pointedly positioned toward criticizing Adolf Hitler during the 30s, during his rise to power, essentially making pictures to kind of warn the world about the dangers that he posed. Unfortunately, the world didn't really listen to what he had to say. John Hartfield is famously quoted as saying that art should be used as a weapon, and the very kind of pointed and specific kind of criticisms that you can see in his pictures kind of speak to that. And he actually lived and worked in Berlin until 1933, when the SS broke into his apartment, and he had to escape through his window, and he hid in a trash can to kind of avoid capture from the SS. He eventually escaped to Czechoslovakia, and he ended up on the Nazis' top 10 most wanted list. Um, uh, it is a painting, but obviously it's made in a very kind of collage-like style. It's Guernica by Pablo Picasso, responding to the Nazis' bombing of the town of Guernica in Spain in the lead up to World War II. Further on, there's Richard Hamilton, 1956. Responding to a very different kind of world condition where, American consumerism seemed to be, really like the defining quality of the country. And again, drawing material from magazines and newspapers to kind of paint a picture of kind of a contemporary national identity. And then Martha Rosler, during the Vietnam War, she made a series of collage using imagery from the magazine Better Homes and Gardens and interspersing pictures from the Vietnam War as a way to kind of try to make people understand the implications of this war being so far away, but trying to give it a sense of immediacy by presenting these scenes within a domestic context. And this is a book I actually just came across like 3 weeks ago. It's a book of poems. It's called Flowers for Hitler, which kind of really blew my mind when I learned about it. I bought a copy of the book and it's filled with really great poems. But it really kind of unnerved me in how, like, the similar kind of titling and thinking had that ground had been covered before. It was a really weird experience to learn about this. I'll just kind of take you through some of the images of the series. I think this picture was made shortly in the beginning of 2017. And most of the series was made just within the first 6 months of the presidency. And while I'm making these, it's a very stream of conscious kind of process where I would be tapped into like listening to political commentary like Rachel Maddow and Morning Joe and other like shows like that, and just really kind of responding in a stream of conscious way by picking up on ideas and news of the day and finding visual metaphors for it in the imagery, and just getting into Photoshop and playing with pictures until I find some kind of weird logic to bind them all together. So the pictures are filled with weird like references to contemporary news. The 800,000 here in this icon represents the 800,000 kids who were covered under the DACA program, the DREAM Act. And I think this picture was made right around the time when this dude was threatening the protections of the DREAM Act. This is a picture that, kind of just responded to the way that we receive all this political news in the form of like talk shows where oftentimes there's entertainment value wrapped into the truth value of what's being reported. And I incorporate a lot of like digital mark making into these pictures. Like you can see the lines here, it's just like the paintbrush in Photoshop. In terms of collage, it's really a game of kind of bringing all these disparate pictures together and trying to find a common identity within all of them. So I found that this kind of digital mark making was a good way to kind of almost act like a glue to kind of bind these different pictures together into a single kind of image logic. And as I went along, I feel like the pictures just became more and more elaborate and more involved. you know, of course, the big question, you know, why I use flowers. I touched on kind of the tradition of floral representation earlier, but I also think that, um, you know, you know, when I first started this work, I was really grappling with the idea of just what good art can do in the face of like real world, you know, political threats. Um, and there's a truism about art in that, you know, the purpose of art is supposed to be, it's supposed to be a beautiful thing. But there's another truism that art is supposed to reflect the times in which it is made. So a lot of these pictures, I mean, all of them really kind of find themselves within this paradox where that notion of art is beauty and that notion of art as a mirror. You know, how do you reconcile those two when they're two very different goals? They don't really fit together. Um, so I think a lot of what I was trying to do in these pictures was just kind of reflect on the role of art itself and what it's supposed to do. And you know, in some ways, I feel like the pictures are kind of a reflection of their own inadequacy because they are just pictures. You know, they like John Hartfield's collages, you know, warning the world about Nazism. They didn't really change anything. So, you know, that's something that I was struggling with throughout the whole process of making these. This is a picture I made just after the inauguration. Um, the, and it was actually, I think, the quickest picture I made. This is all made in just one day. Most of these took like 2 or 3 weeks to resolve. I'm not sure why I got through this one so quickly, but I included this detail image to give you a sense of um, the scale. And the picture in this frame was the photograph of the inauguration crowd that, you know, really famously was the topic of the first press conference of this administration, where Sean Spicer came out and kind of like this rage and fury about how, you know, this was the most attended inauguration crowd in the history of whatever. And the photograph obviously showed that that wasn't the case. So I did this kind of crude clone stamping to kind of add more crowd into this picture. And I just put it in this little frame and hung it on this little wall here. And again, like a lot of the early experience of this presidency was through those early news conferences. So this picture kind of references that context. And if I go into detail a little bit, here are a couple little of a few of the little kind of nuggets that are embedded in the image. Here's your prototypical old angry white man who we have to thank for all of this, maybe. The text on the book spine here is in Russian. It says how to saddle your pony. And out in the window you can see what that's in reference to. I have a very good friend, artist friend, Anastasia Samoylova, who's from Russia, and she got a good chuckle out of seeing the picture. She's the only one who could see it and just like know what it says. And I think this picture is probably the one that best typifies the series as a whole in terms of just the image being a feeling like a total circus. And here are some details of it. Within the flowers, there's a little Twitter bird flying around Moscow, I think, and some chicken nuggets. And again, this is all like really like stream of conscious kind of process. Like when I start making these pictures, I have no idea where they'll end up. So it's always kind of a surprise to me what the end result becomes. And here's the TV on the left. You know, so I came to consider this work kind of a contemporary form of Dada. You know, if you follow my work and know my other projects, you might see a common thread where I often look back to the past and find old kind of artistic traditions or artistic ideas and use new forms of image making to try to update those traditions. I really love the idea of kind of participating in old artistic conversations, and you know, in some sense, I envision these pictures kind of speaking to the pictures that John Hartfield made and the images that Hannah Hawk made, and you know, essentially talking about how the world has changed and how the world has not changed at the same time. This is an image that I made directly following the Charlottesville thing, where there's this just giant crowd of marching racist dudes trolling through town. So I made the pictures kind of resemble I made the flowers kind of resemble like this fiery torch, and I gave the base that kind of khaki pants and white polo t-shirt uniform that they were all wearing for some reason. Not sure what's going on here. And if you look at the margins, I kind of wrapped the picture in a Nazi flag. So it's definitely one of my more pointed, kind of darker images of the group. And this was the last picture I made. All the previous work was made, I think, between the 2016 election and I want to say like May of 2017. And I took a long break from the work just because it became really like emotionally taxing to just always be tapped into the news and to always just be getting just these awful bits of information about what was happening in the world. And I just needed a long break from it. So like a year and a half later, I was named as a foam talent for the work, and that kind of prompted me to revisit the series, and I made one more picture for it. And this is the result of that. I'm not sure what to say about it. It's just calamity. And then a little later on, I published a book called Flowers for Donald and Country's Glorious. This is actually the second edition of the book. The first edition had a kind of a weird story to it. An old colleague of mine, Steve Bissone, who runs a great platform called Urbanautica, based in Italy, he reached out to me, asked me if I wanted to publish a book of the work, and I said sure. And so we worked for a few months on nailing down the design, and we ended up doing a small fundraiser to produce the book. And I think we did like an edition of like 100 or 150. And what happened was that in what was it, in May 2018, we got the books finished, and he shipped me my copies of it. It was like 50 books, and they never arrived. He had shipped them on like May 12th, and he sent me tracking information, and I followed the tracking information, and the books had arrived in New York on like May 17th. And then I was waiting, and I let a week pass, and then another week passed, and they never showed up. And I emailed the post office, and I called the post office, I called customs. Each one sent me back to the other. I just kept getting kind of pushed around in circles, and to this day, I still don't know what happened to those books. the working theory is that maybe some Trump-loving postman or customs agent had seized the images and like just tossed them in a dumpster or something. Like we just don't know what happened to them. But I had done the fundraiser, and there were people who donated to make this book happen, and I felt obliged to get them a book. So I just kind of just went out of my own pocket and produced a new version of it, which ultimately I think came a little closer to my ultimate vision for the book. So this was published in the winter of 2018. And I do have some copies available on my website if you're interested. So in the book, I made a couple derivative series just to put a little more content into it. So this is a short little series that, for the lack of a better term, I called the daffodil variations. So it's just a simple stock images of a vase of daffodils that I went through and just created these different kind of basic manipulations on, kind of thinking about the photograph as this kind of expected vessel of truth. We have an expectation of a picture to contain a certain truth value. And, in this new age we're living in, when, this idea of truth and the malleability of it and the untrustworthiness of seemingly every bit of information that we get now, it felt appropriate to kind of create this little kind of visual of metaphor for the ways that an idea can be kind of twisted or changed or altered in so many different ways. So I think for the book, I made like 12 of these variations. And then just this past fall, I was asked by an artist and curator, Aaron Hedgert. He's a really great artist. He's out in Lubbock, Texas, and he's a part of a cooperative gallery space called Co-opt. He invited me to do a solo show of this work. So I ended up producing about 80 more of these variations for that show, and here are some of them. And so in addition to those, I also made these kind of alternative collages for the book. And these are all rooted in the text transcript from the president's inauguration speech, where I turned the text into a rasterizable image. And then I brought it into Photoshop, and I basically drew this flower over the text. And that I made 2 series of 4 of these pictures, each one kind of takes a core image and kind of goes through these mutations where the image quality kind of degrades from picture to picture until it becomes a kind of monstrosity. I can't give you a full rationalization of why I wanted to do this. It just kind of felt right. And here's an install of that show I did in Lubbock this past fall. And then I apologize for the poor image quality of this, but this is an image from the first Foam Talent Show, which was in Amsterdam, just to give you a sense of the scale of these prints in person. And so that's all I got. Happy to jump into any questions or conversation that comes up. I know I covered a lot, but I'm sure there's a lot left to kind of wonder about.
Great, thank you, Gregory. We do have a couple of questions. We do have a question in the chat by Ricky.
Hey, Ricky.
The question is everything from the internet? Did the early people, including Hannah Hock, use cutout images and glue?
Yeah, I think, I don't know the exact kind of materials they use, but you know, a lot of those Dada artists would draw from newspapers and magazines as their source material, kind of using images of society and of culture to comment on society and culture in turn. But you know, but the Dada movement wasn't just limited to collage. They did a lot of sculptural work. They did a lot of poetry. They did a lot of early video work. And there was a lot of photography too. It was kind of an ethos that crossed through the whole spectrum of artistic media.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the production of the work, of the earlier work, that it was literally cut paper and glued.
Yeah.
But then it was photographed, and then images were made from there. If I'm
Yeah.
could be incorrect, but I think that was the process for making those pictures.
Yeah. I believe they were rephotographed.
Can you talk about, Juliana Foster asked, can you talk about how you approach the making of your book, for instance, editing, sequencing, and approach?
Yeah, totally. So, you know, part of the reason I made those kind of alternative little series to put in the book is because I wanted to create some visual material that could give the book a sense of rhythm. I'm sorry I didn't include page spreads of the book to kind of show you the feel of and the look of it from page to page, but you know, because the flower collages seem so self-contained, you know, I think Alex Soth said it back a while ago, that there are images that are made specifically for a wall and images made specifically for a book, where like some pictures can feel like in and of themselves, like a kind of visual meal where you don't need anything else. But some pictures also feel more fragmentary, where they rely on other images to kind of create a larger cohesive whole. So with my approach to sequencing and editing the book, I basically allowed a full page spreads of the flower pictures and interspersed them with the little daffodil variations, as well as the sequences of the text collages, and kind of went back and forth between each of them as you flip the pages. So so as you flip a page, you don't know what's coming next, if it's going to be the full collage, or if it's going to be a little daffodil, or if it's going to be one of the text collages. I'm sorry, I should have included spreads from the book to kind of illustrate that more clearly.
So, I have a comment from Ron Tarver, I just think it would be nice to hear your response, is that the prints look flat in your presentation, but in the exhibition image, they look layered. Is there a difference between kind of how we're seeing them on screen versus the physical print, or everything's done in Photoshop, correct?
Yeah. All of the work is done solely in Photoshop, so there's no physical layering at all. It's purely a digital collage. I mean, maybe the kind of alternative perspective of like seeing the prints from the side might give a sense of dimensionality, but the images on the paper are quite flat, and they're printed on kind of a luster sheen paper, so there's a bit of a gloss to it that makes it kind of look like you're looking at a screen, which is kind of how I hope the pictures would be read, as if they're like a kind of a touch screen or something like that.
Great, thank you. I have another question from Eric Huntsman. Mr. Trump's strategy of information overload has worked, as many of us are now sitting complacent and not pushing the discussions in protest. Are you planning on making more work in the last 6 months of his presidency to bookend the initial 6 months?
That's a great question. I don't know. I hope we're in the last 6 months right now. God help us if we're not. You know, I thought about it. My wife Steph has been pushing me to make a new one in the context of this, you know, this pandemic that we're going through. So maybe I might do that. But you know, as I mentioned, like I stopped making the pictures just because it got really just kind of emotionally taxing. Like every time I would kind of tap into the news and be making these pictures, like I would just end up in this really dark place, and it's hard to. So I felt like I just had to disengage with that. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I should, but I just don't know yet. Maybe I'll sit down this weekend and try to make a new one and see how I feel about it.
Yeah, I know in the at the beginning of this pandemic, I spent a lot of time reading the news in the middle of the night, and I realized it was not helping me do the work that I needed to do.
Yeah. And I remember, like, you know, right after he was elected, like there was so much tension about, you know, will our kind of worst imaginations for what could come of this actually kind of come to fruition? Like we weren't sure if, you know, he would turn around and, you know, be not that bad like some people were hoping, or if you know, the decisions he made and his motivations really were going to be as bad as we feared. And here we are now in this pandemic, you know, after 3.5 years where, yeah, like the worst of it really, you know, has come to light. Yeah, it's.
So kind of in, there's a couple more questions in the chat, so I'm going to just bounce around, but if
Sure.
your questions earlier, I didn't forget you, but kind of in this conversation about the presidency, Ron Tauber asked, have you gotten any responses from Trump supporters?
No, I haven't, surprisingly. I mean, maybe they just don't follow the channels that I share the pictures in. When I did the book, I actually emailed the White House with a request that the president write the essay for the book. I never got a response back, unfortunately. But no, I haven't gotten any kind of response from people who support this president. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe I'm not sharing the work in the way that I should if I haven't heard back from anyone in that regard.
So kind of following that question, Victoria is asking, Mike is asking, in these turbulent, incredibly turbulent times, even crazier than 2016, what are you working on now?
So for the past couple of years, I've been working on a different project that I think very much responds to our times, but in a much more diffuse kind of way. I don't want to give away too much about the project yet, but it's basically, you know, similar to how I'm responding to Dadaism and trying to kind of update those traditions. There's a poem called The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot that was written also, you know, during that modernist era in the wake of World War I, where it's written in a very collage-like style, and he's kind of reflecting on the fragmented, kind of broken character of Europe, particularly of England after the war. And so I've found a kind of kinship with that poem, and I've been making work kind of using the literary strategies that he used and kind of interpreting them into visual form. And considering it kind of an update to that poem in light of just how kind of fragmented and broken things feel in our current moment. I'm still very much in the middle of the project, so I'm not ready to share too much of it yet, but maybe in the next year or so. The publication of that poem was in 1922, so I'm aiming to publish a book in 2022. So maybe in 2022 you could see the results of that.
I think it's a good time to mention the in-between too, because that's also something that you work on, and I imagine it takes up a lot of your time.
Yeah. In the in-between is a publishing project that I started in 2012. It's always been kind of more of a passion project of mine, so there are periods where I'm very active with it, but other periods where I kind of stagnate. Right now, we're kind of in a downturn, but we're about to announce an open call for for work in the next few days to try to get it up and going again. But you know, if I was born with any kind of innate talent, it was probably as a writer. I love to write criticism. I love to write about photography. So, you know, creating my own publishing platform has given me the opportunity to do that, as well as to, you know, just get out of my own kind of mental space and my own visual space and engage in a deeper way with other artists who I think are making really incredible work. So I write interviews, I write book reviews, exhibition reviews, I publish portfolios. I invite other writers to contribute writing to the platform. Yeah, check it out, intheinbetween.com. There's a lot of great work on there, I think.
Great, thank you. I just want to highlight a couple of comments and another question in the chat. Victoria shared such wonderful work. It's amazing how you were able to tap into your creativity when many of us were feeling frustration and uncertainty post-election.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, at the end of the day, like all the work is for me to just vent. You know, if I could boil it down, you know, really, I mean, it seems cliche to say, but, you know, it's really just me trying to express myself and to just get all of that out of my system. It hasn't fully worked, but it helped.
Yeah, I mean, as artists, we always have something to say, and even if we can't say it verbally or know exactly what we're doing, I mean, I really appreciated your trust in the process in terms of making work, in terms of not necessarily knowing what your outcomes were, but trusting the process. I think is a really important takeaway as artists, because we don't always know exactly why we're doing what we do.
Yeah.
But we do have the faith and belief that we have to do it, and that at some point it will make sense and it will be meaningful.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I tell myself that I tell myself to abide by kind of ethos, to always try to work kind of just beyond my edge of understanding what I'm doing. I think that's a way to really kind of learn more about what's inside of me and what kind of comes out of me. Like, I never really understand the pictures I make until kind of a while later, while I've had time to kind of rationalize the decisions that go into any image. And yeah, I think just not being afraid to make bad work, because you have to get through the bad work to get through the good work. Like, I showed you those 3 early images kind of earlier on in my presentation that I look back now and I'm like, God, they're so awful looking. But if I didn't push through that, like, I wouldn't have been able to make the more successful pictures. So it's just trust that, you know, if you just keep on going, if you keep on pushing, the craft will refine itself and the ideas will resolve themselves, and you'll find yourself in a creative territory that you can really call your own.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I mean, I always say that it's a relationship between you and your work.
Yeah.
And I find it very, I really love that you shared those early pictures, to give us an understanding of kind of your process and that need to just keep making.
Yeah.
Hold on. Oh, Karen asked, can your work be viewed on social media sites? It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I post them once in a while to my Instagram. I don't use Facebook as much as I used to anymore. Like, so yeah, I mean, so it's not so much on social media, I guess. Of course, it's been like 3 years since I've really been invested in the work. It's crazy to say that. It feels like, you know, I was just making them yesterday. So I don't share them as often as I used to, but, you know, they're around here and there. And I've done a few interviews on the work online that you could probably dig around and find to learn a little more about them as well.
Great. So does anyone else have any other questions? You can post it in the chat, or we can unmute you if you guys want to have more of a free form conversation. All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight. I want to thank you, Gregory, for being so revealing and honest and insightful about not only your practice, but the practice of making art. So thank you so much. Again, I want to thank everyone for being here. It's lovely to see the community continue to stay engaged. Our next week photo talk is with Sheila Pre-Bright. And so that will be at 7 o'clock next Thursday. Make sure you check out our online classes, as well as our new products in our printing and framing department. We've come up with some creative new ideas, and become a member, help support PPAC, support each other, be positive, be creative. And I love seeing all your smiling faces. So have a wonderful night. Thank you again, Gregory, so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
For being
Thanks,
here.
guys.
Everyone I'm trying to take screenshots of the chat so that I can share all the positive comments with you, because everyone has really enjoyed your work. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.